An FBI agent accused the old veteran of leaking secrets, until SEAL Team 6 burst in the room. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The courtroom was eerily silent as FBI agent James Donovan stood towering over the frail, elderly man in the defendant's chair. With his sharp suit and cold demeanor, Donovan exuded authority, but his eyes betrayed a sense of disdain as he looked down at the old veteran before him. The courtroom was filled with tension as the judge tapped his gavel impatiently, signaling the start of the hearing. "Martin Kelly," Donovan began, his voice laced with mockery. "You are accused of leaking classified information to the enemy. The evidence is damning, and it's time for you to explain yourself." The old man, Martin Kelly, remained motionless in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on a distant point, not even glancing up at the agent. His face was weathered, etched with the passage of years and memories too painful to relive. His hands, shaking slightly from age, rested on the wheels of his chair, but he made no move to defend himself. "I'm sure you're aware of the gravity of these accusations," Donovan continued, his voice rising with each word, as if trying to provoke a reaction. "But you, an old man, a relic of a time long past, won't be able to escape this one. You think your silence will save you? Think again." The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge glanced up, his sharp gaze narrowing at Kelly. "Mr. Kelly, are you going to answer the agent's question, or shall we move to the next stage of this hearing?" Martin's eyes finally shifted, his gaze calm, almost indifferent. "I have nothing to hide," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper but carrying a weight of authority. Donovan sneered. "You have nothing to hide," he mocked. "Then why don't you explain why your name keeps coming up in top-secret government files? Why don't you tell us what you were really doing during those years? Were you some kind of hero, or just a cowardly traitor hiding behind a medal?" The insult was clear, but Martin Kelly remained unfazed, his silence speaking volumes. Donovan leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, threatening tone. "You're not fooling anyone, old man. We have proof. Your medals, your so-called heroics, they're all part of the lie." Martin didn't flinch. Instead, his hand drifted to the old, tarnished medal hanging around his neck, a faded ribbon hanging loosely from his chest. "This medal," Martin said, his voice steady, "is not a decoration. It's a reminder of something far greater than what you'll ever understand." Donovan let out a dry laugh, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "A reminder? Of what? That you were once a soldier? A hero in your own mind? It's nothing but a trinket now, just like you." Martin's gaze didn't waver. He didn't speak again, but the air around him seemed to thicken. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone knew something was about to change. Donovan's smirk grew, but before he could say anything more, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "That's enough." The sound of boots clicking on the floor echoed, growing louder with each step. Heads turned, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. 3 men, dressed in impeccable military uniforms, walked into the courtroom. They weren't police officers or ordinary personnel. These men were something else entirely. The air shifted. General Thompson, a towering figure with 4 silver stars gleaming on his uniform, stepped into the room. His presence alone commanded attention, and for the first time that day, the smug FBI agent Donovan hesitated. The general's eyes scanned the room, landing on Martin Kelly, who had not moved from his chair. Donovan, visibly taken aback, tried to speak, but the general raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Agent Donovan," the general's voice boomed, "I suggest you step aside. You've misjudged this man." Donovan stood frozen, his face pale as the reality of the situation sank in. The general's gaze never left Kelly, and without another word, he walked toward the old man in the wheelchair. "Sergeant Major Martin Kelly," General Thompson said, his voice thick with respect and admiration. "It's an honor to be in your presence, sir." The room was still. Even Donovan, whose arrogance had moments ago been unshakable, stood in stunned silence. "You've been accused wrongly," Sergeant Major. The general continued, his eyes now sweeping over the room. And I'm here to set the record straight. I'll tell you something you may not know about Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. His past is more than just a blur of medals and forgotten wars. It is a story of resilience, of heroism that the world never saw, and of sacrifice that no one can truly comprehend. General Thompson stood tall before Martin Kelly, the silence in the room thickening as everyone tried to process what had just happened. Donovan, who had been so sure of himself, now stood frozen, his face draining of color as the reality of his mistake set in. The general's presence was overwhelming, his 4 stars gleaming in the dim courtroom light. The room was in absolute silence, save for the sound of the general's boots clicking against the hard floor as he approached Kelly. It was almost as though time itself had stopped. The general's eyes were filled with an unspoken understanding, and as he stood in front of the old man, a quiet respect filled the space between them. Sergeant Major Kelly, General Thompson began, his voice low and powerful. This is long overdue. His words carried weight, the kind that made the rest of the room shrink back. Kelly, who had been a part of history no one else could touch, looked up, his eyes meeting the general's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a shared moment of recognition, of 2 men who had both fought battles no one could fully understand. I should have done this a long time ago, General Thompson continued, his voice carrying the weight of an apology. I should have recognized your sacrifices, your loyalty to this country. But that's something I can only make right now. Kelly's gaze didn't waver. He didn't need any recognition. He wasn't in it for the medals or the glory. All he ever wanted was to serve, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The silence stretched between them until Donovan finally broke it, his voice shaking with uncertainty. What is this? Donovan asked, his tone faltering. What is going on here? This man, he's just a relic, a soldier from a past era. He's a nobody. General. Thompson didn't even look at him. A relic? The general repeated, his voice ice cold. You have no idea what you're talking about. The room seemed to breathe again as the general's attention turned back to Kelly. Sergeant Major Kelly, I owe you a debt that this country can never repay. You are a living legend, one of the few who helped shape the very fabric of our military. Without men like you, there would be no military as we know it today. The words were a balm to Kelly's weary soul. He had fought in wars no one cared to remember. He had made sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. Yet here was the general, standing in front of him, acknowledging his worth. Donovan, on the other hand, seemed to shrink back with every word. He was a man who had built his career on appearances, on the idea of authority. But standing before a man who had earned true respect, he had nothing left. His bravado melted away, replaced by a flicker of fear that quickly spread. General Thompson took a deep breath and looked around the room, his voice now firm. This is not just about Martin Kelly. This is about all of us who serve, who wear the uniform, who give everything for this country. We don't get to decide who is worthy of respect. We don't get to mock the sacrifices of those who have given it all. This is a lesson, Donovan. A lesson you will remember for the rest of your career. The general's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Donovan couldn't meet the general's gaze. The shame was palpable, and he knew there was no way to undo what he had done. Kelly, for his part, said nothing. He didn't need to. The general had spoken for him. As the tension in the room began to shift, a murmur went through the crowd. The door to the courtroom opened, and 2 more officers walked in, one of them a woman with a stern expression. She was carrying a thick file, one that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. The general's gaze shifted toward her, and without a word, she handed him the file. He opened it, quickly scanning the contents, his eyes narrowing as he read the details. As he finished, he turned back to Kelly. This, the general said, is the file that should have been opened to you long ago. He handed the file over to Kelly, and the old man took it, his fingers brushing the paper lightly. There was no sense of triumph in his expression. He had never asked for any of this. He had only wanted to do his job, to serve his country, to be left alone. Thank you, sir, Kelly said, his voice soft but steady. He had nothing else to say, but that was enough. The general nodded, understanding. The room, once full of tension and judgment, now seemed to shift, as if the weight of respect had settled in. It was a turning point, not just for Kelly, but for everyone who had underestimated him. General Thompson's presence had changed everything. Donovan, for all his authority, stood powerless in the face of true respect. As the general walked out, the room fell into a profound silence. The kind of silence that only comes after a truth has been revealed. And for the first time that day, Martin Kelly felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. As the courtroom doors swung open, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. General Thompson had made his presence known, but it wasn't just his appearance that caused the shift. It was the power of his words, the weight of history, and the respect that radiated from his every move. Donovan stood in stunned silence, his face pale as the reality of his blunder set in. The old man, Martin Kelly, remained unmoved by the drama unfolding around him. For Kelly, this wasn't about the show. It was never about the recognition or the moment. It was about the silent battles he had fought, the ones no one knew about, the ones that had left scars deeper than any medal could cover. General Thompson's voice cut through the silence again. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, his tone firm but filled with genuine respect. "You've fought battles that this nation will never fully understand. And for that, we owe you more than just an apology." As the words left the general's mouth, Kelly simply nodded. There was no need for grand gestures or speeches. He had long stopped expecting anything from anyone. His eyes never left the general's, as if to say that he didn't need anything except to be left with his memories. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone in the courtroom, from the bailiff to the judge, from the FBI agents to the onlookers, could feel the shift in power. But none of them dared to speak. Kelly had become the center of a storm, not because of anything he had done in the past few hours, but because of what he represented. He was a living testament to everything the rest of them could never fully grasp. General Thompson didn't waste any more time. He looked at Donovan with an intensity that made the FBI agent take a step back. "You've made a grave mistake, Donovan," the general said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "And you will learn from it, one way or another." Donovan, still in shock, opened his mouth to protest, but the general held up a hand. "Not a word. You will follow the proper procedures now, and you will respect this man, or you will face the consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Donovan swallowed hard, his confidence shattered. He was no longer the man in control. The general had taken that away in a matter of seconds. Kelly, however, didn't seem interested in the drama unfolding. He hadn't been looking for vengeance or even acknowledgement. All he wanted was to be left in peace. But peace, it seemed, was not something he would find today. The door to the courtroom opened once again, and this time, it wasn't just another officer entering the room. It was an old friend, a man Kelly hadn't seen in years. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harris, a veteran of many campaigns, stepped into the room with a nod of recognition. The general's eyes met Harris's, and without a word, the two men exchanged a silent understanding. Kelly, who had been staring down at his hands, finally allowed himself to look up. There was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, something between surprise and a quiet acknowledgement. Harris walked up to Kelly, his steps slow, measured. "You look well, old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Kelly's lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes remained heavy with the burden of years gone by. "I get by," Kelly replied softly. Harris nodded, and for a brief moment, the two men stood in silence. Two soldiers who had seen too much, said too little, and lost more than they had ever hoped to gain. General Thompson, observing the interaction, stepped aside. The room had shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just the words or the power that had caused the change. It was the bond between two men who had been through the fire together, who understood each other without needing to speak. "Sergeant Major Kelly," Thompson said, his voice now softer, though still filled with authority. "You've earned more than the nation will ever know, and I will make sure you get the recognition you deserve." Kelly's eyes, usually so calm and composed, now carried a flicker of something more. It wasn't pride or joy, but something far deeper, gratitude. "I didn't do it for the recognition," Kelly replied, his voice steady. "I did it because it needed to be done." Harris, standing beside him, placed a hand on Kelly's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "And that's why we'll never forget you, old friend," he said, his voice thick with admiration. The general nodded, acknowledging Harris's words. He is a living legend, and it's time the world knew that. Donovan, who had been silent throughout the exchange, now found himself standing on the outside looking in. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and he was no longer the man with the answers. As Kelly, Harris, and Thompson stood together, united in a bond forged through years of service, Donovan was left to contemplate the gravity of what had just transpired. He had tried to break a man who had been broken long ago, but instead, he had inadvertently made him stronger. And in the end, it was that strength that would carry Kelly through the rest of his days, silent, unyielding, and forever remembered. It's been hours since General Thompson made his presence known, and the courtroom had changed completely. What was once a place of tension and accusation now felt like a distant memory. Donovan stood off to the side, his thoughts clouded with regret. But Martin Kelly, sitting quietly in his chair, didn't seem to care. He wasn't a man who sought recognition. He wasn't a man who cared for anyone's pity or praise. His battles were long over, his victories achieved in silence, far away from the eyes of the world. The general stood beside him, having just acknowledged Kelly's long-forgotten service. For the first time, the veteran didn't feel as if he was invisible. Not in the eyes of the general, anyway. "I have called in the files," Thompson said, his tone calm but resolute. "There's something you need to see, Martin. The world needs to understand who you are." Kelly gave a faint nod, but his expression remained unchanged. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the recognition, but there was a part of him that had long ago buried those old memories, the ones filled with gunfire and the echo of fallen comrades. He'd lived through them, survived them, and yet they never truly left him. They stayed, locked in the back of his mind, where they couldn't hurt him anymore. "You know," the general continued, "what happened to you? To all of us, during that mission in the mountains, it was something no one would ever believe. But we need to make sure the truth comes out." Kelly looked at him, his blue eyes steady and unwavering. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "I did what I had to do. That's all." But Thompson shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, Martin. What you did, what you endured, no one else could have. You saved men who were meant to be forgotten. You gave them hope when all was lost." Kelly's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no joy in it. "It was my job," he replied simply. But even as he said it, he knew the general was right. He had been more than just a soldier. He had been a lifeline, a beacon in the darkest moments of war. As the general spoke of the mission in the mountains, Kelly's mind drifted back to that night, to the sound of distant artillery, to the men huddling together, hoping against hope that someone would come for them. It had been 3 days since they were stranded, surrounded by the enemy, with no way to call for help. The radios were dead, the helicopters couldn't get through. But Kelly had been there. With nothing but a few supplies and his experience, he had found a way to get them out, carrying one man after another on his back, through the mud and the rain, through enemy fire, until they finally reached safety. It was a miracle, a story no one would ever believe. But it was true, and that's when Kelly had earned the title of the Shepherd, a name that had been whispered through the ranks, a name that had become a legend. "This is the part of your story they need to hear," Thompson said, pulling a file from his briefcase and handing it to Kelly. The man's hands were steady as he took it, but his heart clenched as he opened the pages. There it was, the mission report, the photographs, the list of names, the acknowledgement that, despite everything, he had saved lives. He hadn't done it for the recognition. He hadn't even done it for the men he saved. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. But now, as he looked at the evidence of his actions, he realized that this wasn't just his story. It was their story too. The men he had carried, the men who had fought beside him, who had made it out because of him. It was a story that deserved to be told. "It's time," Thompson said, his voice steady. "This needs to be in the records. The world deserves to know who you really are, Martin." Kelly glanced at him and then back at the file. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "Let it be known," then he muttered. "But it's not just my story. It's theirs too." The general smiled, a rare expression of warmth crossing his face. "It will be, and they will remember." The courtroom, which had once felt so cold and dismissive, now felt like a place of solemn respect. Donovan, still standing in the corner, couldn't escape the weight of his mistake. He had underestimated Kelly. He had judged a man based on his age, based on his appearance, based on the fact that Kelly had been invisible to him. But now, Donovan knew the truth. And as he looked at Kelly, standing tall in the presence of the general, he realized just how much he had misjudged him. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. The past couldn't be erased, but the future could be different. Kelly wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend, a hero whose name would be remembered, and no one, not even the FBI or the judge, could take that away. The room had fallen into an unnatural quiet, the kind that only comes after a life-changing revelation. General Thompson, standing at the head of the room, had made his point clear. Martin Kelly wasn't just a forgotten soldier. He was a man who had earned his place in history, and now, everyone who had ever doubted him was forced to confront the truth. Donovan, still standing in the corner, couldn't look at Kelly. He couldn't look at anyone. The weight of his mistake was too heavy. He had spent so long judging the old man based on his age, his frail appearance, and his silence. He had treated Kelly like a relic, but now, he saw the truth in front of him. Kelly wasn't just a veteran, he was a hero. And heroes weren't defined by their age or their appearance. They were defined by their actions. The door to the courtroom opened again, and this time it wasn't another officer or agent. It was a young man, fresh-faced, eager, and ready to face the world. Lieutenant Ben Carter stepped into the room, his military uniform pressed and neat, his posture straight and respectful. His eyes scanned the room, quickly settling on Kelly, who was still sitting in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. Carter had heard the stories, the whispers in the halls of the Pentagon. He had been told about Sergeant Major Kelly, but like everyone else, he had never truly understood. Now, as he stood in the presence of the man who had saved so many, Carter realized just how little he knew. General Thompson nodded toward Carter. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "This is Martin Kelly, a man whose legacy you need to learn." Carter swallowed, his heart racing. He had heard the rumors, the talk about the legendary shepherd who had saved countless lives during a mission that no one wanted to talk about. But standing here, face to face with the man, he felt a deep sense of humility. "Sergeant Major Kelly," Carter said, his voice firm but respectful. "It's an honor to meet you." Kelly nodded slightly, acknowledging the young officer's presence. There was no grand speech, no fanfare, just the simple recognition of a job well done, of a life lived in service. The room seemed to grow even quieter as the weight of the moment settled over them all. Donovan, still struggling with his own guilt, looked up at Kelly. He had seen the man as nothing more than a relic, a shadow of a past era. But now, as he stood there, he realized how wrong he had been. Kelly had lived a life of purpose, a life filled with sacrifice and dedication. And now, it was time for him to be remembered. Carter, eager to learn, looked at the general. "Sir, what happened to Kelly? What's the story?" Thompson's eyes softened as he turned to face the young lieutenant. "It's not a story you can find in any textbook, Lieutenant. It's not a story the world wants to remember. But it's a story of true heroism. A story of a man who did the impossible, and did it without asking for anything in return." Thompson paused, his voice heavy with emotion. In 1968, during the Battle of Khe Sanh, Sergeant Major Kelly's unit was surrounded. They were trapped, with no way to call for help. The radios were down, the air support couldn't get through. But Kelly, with nothing but his training and his experience, went in alone. He carried out his men one by one, through the jungle, through enemy lines, without regard for his own safety. He did it for one reason, because it was the right thing to do. And he saved every single one of them. Carter stood frozen, unable to process the gravity of what he had just heard. The stories he had heard had always been shrouded in mystery, whispers of a legendary soldier who had done the impossible. But hearing it from the general, hearing it from someone who had witnessed Kelly's actions firsthand, made it real. But no one ever knew. Thompson continued, his voice quieter now. Kelly never took credit. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted to do his job and move on. But it's time the world knew who he really is. It's time the world knew that men like him don't just fade into obscurity. Donovan, who had been standing to the side, now found his voice. But why now? Why is this all coming out now? Thompson turned his gaze to Donovan, his eyes filled with resolve. Because the truth deserves to be known. Because Kelly deserves to be honored for the hero he is. And because, in a world where we often forget the sacrifices made by men like him, it's time for the world to remember. Kelly, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. It doesn't matter now, he said softly, his voice steady but filled with a lifetime of experience. I've lived my life. I've done what I needed to do. It's over. Carter, still in awe of the man before him, stepped forward. It's not over, he said, his voice firm. Your story is just beginning. The world will know what you did. The world will know who you are. Kelly looked at the young lieutenant, a faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes. Maybe, he said quietly, but it's not for me. It's for the men I saved. For them, it's never over. The room fell silent again, each person in the room understanding that they had just witnessed something monumental. For Donovan, it was a moment of reckoning, a moment when he understood the true meaning of service. For Carter, it was the beginning of a journey to understand the legacy of a man who had given everything for his country. And for Kelly, it was a quiet acknowledgement that, even in his old age, he had left a legacy that would never be forgotten. The next few days felt surreal to Martin Kelly. His quiet life, one that had remained in the shadows for so long, had suddenly become the center of attention. The general's words, the respect he had been shown, and the memories he had tried to bury all came rushing back, each one sharper than the last. But Kelly wasn't a man who lived in the past. He didn't crave attention, and he certainly didn't need anyone's approval. He had done his duty, and in his mind, that was enough. But now, as the days passed, he found himself in a position he had never anticipated, one where his story was being told, not just by him, but by others who had lived it with him. General Thompson had made sure the world knew who Kelly really was, and it had sent shockwaves through the military and beyond. The news spread quickly, and soon, stories of the legendary shepherd were all anyone could talk about. Martin Kelly had been a part of a forgotten chapter in history, but now the world was listening. For Kelly, it was both a blessing and a curse. The accolades were nice, but they were not what he had sought. What he had always wanted was simply to do what he had been trained to do. He hadn't cared for the fame, the medals, or the recognition. What mattered to him was the men he had saved, the ones who had made it home because of him. Those were the real victories. As the phone rang in his small apartment, Kelly glanced at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he picked it up anyway. Sergeant Major Kelly? The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative. This is Colonel William Harris. I served with you back in the day, during that mission in the mountains. I heard what happened, and I just wanted to say thank you. Kelly smiled faintly. It had been years since he had heard from Harris, and yet, here he was, calling to acknowledge the very mission that had nearly broken them all. It's good to hear from you, Colonel, Kelly replied, his voice steady. I didn't do it for thanks. I know you didn't, Harris said, his voice filled with respect. But the world needs to know what you did. The world needs to understand the cost of those decisions, the sacrifice it took to save the men who were with you. You were more than just a soldier. You were a lifeline, and that's something people need to remember. Kelly felt the familiar knot in his chest. He hadn't done it for glory, for recognition, or for anyone else's approval. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. But hearing Harris speak like this, he knew that the story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the men who had been saved, the ones who had been left behind, and the legacy of service that would carry on. I don't need the world to know, Kelly said quietly, looking out the window at the city below. But if it helps them understand the cost of war, then I guess it's worth it. You don't need to carry it alone anymore, Martin, Harris said, his voice firm. The world needs to know what kind of man you are, what kind of soldier you were. Your story needs to be told, for those who can't tell it for themselves. Kelly was silent for a long moment, the weight of those words settling over him. He had never been one to seek out attention. He had always preferred to stay in the background, far away from the spotlight. But now he understood. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the stories that had gone untold, about the people who had sacrificed so much and were never recognized for it. I'll make sure they remember, Kelly said, his voice resolute. But it's not just my story. It's all of ours. After the call ended, Kelly sat in silence for a while, letting the words wash over him. He had done what needed to be done, and he had lived with the consequences. But now, as his story began to unfold in ways he hadn't expected, he realized that he had nothing left to prove. His legacy was no longer just his own. It belonged to the men he had served with, to the people who had given their all, and to the future generations who would one day hear his story and know the true meaning of sacrifice. As he glanced at the small medal around his neck, the one that had never meant much to him, Kelly finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Gratitude for the life he had lived, for the battles he had fought, and for the men who had made it home because of him. And as the days went by, the recognition kept coming from old friends, from new allies, from people who had heard his story and finally understood. But Kelly, ever humble, continued on as he always had, quietly, steadily, and with the same sense of duty that had guided him through every battle. The world would remember him, but he would remain the same man he had always been, a soldier, a protector, and a man who did what was necessary, no matter the cost. The days after General Thompson's visit felt like a blur for Martin Kelly. The recognition, the phone calls, the constant attention, it was all overwhelming. Kelly had always been a man of solitude, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight, to quietly do his part and leave without fanfare. Now, it seemed the world had decided it was time for him to step forward. But Kelly wasn't sure how he felt about it. Every time someone spoke of him as a hero, as a legend, a part of him recoiled. He didn't want the attention. He didn't want the title. He had done what he did because it was the right thing to do, not for the accolades that came with it. Sitting in his small apartment, Kelly looked at the medal hanging on the wall, the same one he had worn for so many years. It wasn't a symbol of glory or pride for him. It was just a reminder of the lives he had saved, of the men who never made it home, and of the sacrifices he had made that no one would ever truly understand. The world could call him a hero, but he knew the truth. The truth was far more complex than any label could describe. He had lost so much along the way, friends, comrades, pieces of his own soul. And yet, he had survived. He had done what needed to be done. And now, as the phone rang again, Kelly braced himself for another call, another round of interviews, another round of people who wanted to hear his story. He picked up the receiver and answered. Sergeant Major Kelly? The voice was familiar. Colonel Harris, the man who had served alongside him all those years ago. I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing. Kelly let out a sigh, rubbing his temple. It's a lot, Colonel, he admitted. I didn't expect any of this. Harris chuckled on the other end of the line. Yeah, I know the feeling. But the world needs to hear it. They need to know who you really are. Kelly sat back in his chair, staring out the window at the city below. It was a beautiful day, but inside, he felt nothing but heaviness. I don't need the world to know me, Kelly replied quietly. I've lived my life. I've done my job. That's enough for me. You know, Harris said, his tone turning serious. It's not just about you. It's about the men you saved. It's about showing people what real heroism looks like. Kelly didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to explain it. The truth was, he wasn't interested in being a symbol of anything. He wasn't looking for validation from anyone. All he wanted was peace. But he knew the world didn't work that way. His actions, whether he liked it or not, had changed the course of history. And now, people were paying attention. I get it, Kelly finally said, his voice weary. But I did it for them, not for the recognition. I did it because I had to. Because they were depending on me. Harris was silent for a moment before speaking again. I know. And that's why you're a legend. Because you did it without asking for anything in return. The world needs to understand that. They need to know that there are still men like you out there. Men who do what's right, no matter the cost. Kelly felt a pang in his chest. The weight of Harris's words settled in. Maybe the world did need to understand. Maybe it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the legacy of service, of sacrifice, and of courage in the face of insurmountable odds. Maybe it was time for him to stop hiding. The world had a way of twisting stories, of turning ordinary men into icons. But Kelly wasn't ordinary. He had lived a life full of pain, regret, and loss. And yet, he had endured. That was the true measure of heroism. Not the medals or the praise, but the ability to keep going, no matter the cost. You've got to tell them, Martin, Harris said, breaking the silence. You've got to let them know what you did. Not for you, but for them. The ones you saved. The ones who never got to come home. Kelly took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He had never been one to ask for help, but now, he realized that maybe it was time to let his story be told. Not for the recognition, but for the men who hadn't made it out of that jungle, for the ones who were left behind. Okay, Kelly said, his voice quiet but firm. I'll do it. The decision was made. He couldn't keep running from the past. It was time to face it. It was time to share his story, not as a hero, but as a man who had done what needed to be done. As the conversation ended, Kelly sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his decision settling over him. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was telling theirs. The men he had saved, the ones who had fought by his side, and the ones who had never made it home. And as he stood up from his chair, ready to face the world once more, Kelly knew one thing for sure. His journey wasn't over yet. Martin Kelly had made his decision, and as the days passed, he found himself preparing for something he never thought he'd have to face. It wasn't the media attention that unnerved him. It wasn't the interviews or the accolades. It was the reminder, the weight of the stories he'd carried for so long, stories that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. But now, the world wanted to know. They wanted to understand why a man like him, a man who had survived the worst, had quietly carried on without seeking recognition. Kelly sat in his small apartment, staring at the file General Thompson had handed him. It wasn't just a collection of documents. It was a piece of his life, a life that had been buried under layers of silence. He hadn't thought about those days in years, the days when he had led men through hell, when every step had been a battle against the odds, when the weight of responsibility had been the heaviest thing he'd ever carried. But now, as he flipped through the pages, the memories came flooding back. There was no escaping them. He had saved lives, more lives than he cared to count, but it had come at a cost. The faces of the men he had lost still haunted him, their names forever etched in his mind. Kelly had always believed that heroes didn't need to be celebrated. They didn't need to be remembered by the world. He had done his part, and that was enough. But now, he realized something that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about the fame, the praise, or the recognition. It was about the truth. It was about telling the story of the men who never made it out, the ones who had given everything and had been forgotten. For years, they had been lost to history, their sacrifices never acknowledged. But Kelly wasn't going to let that happen anymore. His story was theirs. It was time for the world to hear it. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was a number he recognized. General Thompson. Martin. The general's voice was firm, filled with respect. It's time. The world is ready to hear your story. Kelly nodded, even though the general couldn't see him. He had known this moment would come. It had been inevitable. I know, Kelly replied, his voice steady. I'm ready. You don't have to do this, the general said, a rare moment of softness in his tone. But the world needs to know, and you need to be heard. Kelly didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He had made his peace with the past, but now, he knew what he had to do. The truth had to be told, no matter how painful it might be. He had lived with these memories for long enough. It was time to share them, to make sure that the men he had fought beside were never forgotten. I'll do it, Kelly said finally. For them. General Thompson let out a quiet breath, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. I'll handle the arrangements, he said. You just tell the story. The rest will take care of itself. The conversation ended, but Kelly sat there for a while, lost in thought. He hadn't wanted any of this. He hadn't wanted the world to know his name, to know his past. But now that it was happening, he felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about those who had been lost to time, those who had never had the chance to tell their story. He owed it to them. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Interviews, meetings, paperwork. It was all a whirlwind. But through it all, Kelly stayed focused on one thing, telling the truth. He didn't care about the cameras, the reporters, or the public reaction. He cared about honoring the memory of the men who had served with him, the ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. As the day of the broadcast approached, Kelly felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. It was the weight of duty, the weight of responsibility that had never truly left him. This wasn't just a story about him. It was a story about all of them, the men who had been forgotten, the men who had fought and bled in silence. And now, it was time to give them a voice. When the camera light turned on, Kelly didn't hesitate. He told the story as it had happened, not as he remembered it, but as it truly was. The pain, the fear, the loss, all of it was there, laid bare for the world to see. But he also told the story of survival, of courage in the face of impossible odds. He spoke of the men he had carried, of the lives he had saved, and of the bond they had shared. It wasn't just his story, it was theirs. And as the broadcast ended and the lights dimmed, Kelly felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. The truth had been told, and the men he had fought alongside would never be forgotten again. In the days following the broadcast, Martin Kelly found himself caught between two worlds. One world was the quiet life he had always known, the life of a man who had done his duty and then faded into the background. The other world was the one that had opened up in front of him, the world of recognition, admiration, and a history that was no longer his own to keep silent. It was a strange feeling, and for Kelly, one that he wasn't sure how to navigate. He had done what was right, and now the world knew his story. But what did it mean for him? What did it mean for the men he had saved, for the ones who were no longer here to tell their own stories? The days blurred together as the calls continued to come in. Interviews, media requests, people wanting to hear more, wanting to know every detail. Kelly did his best to stay focused on the core of what mattered. He had been part of something bigger than himself, part of a brotherhood that had faced the unimaginable. That was where the true honor lay, not in the spotlight but in the bonds that had been forged in the heat of battle. It was early one morning when the phone rang again. It wasn't a reporter this time. It was General Thompson. "Martin." The general's voice was steady, calm. "The story has spread farther than we anticipated. The impact is being felt across the country. You've done something remarkable." Kelly leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "I didn't do it for the impact," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. It was always about them. The men he had saved, the ones who had never made it out, those were the people he thought of now." "I know, Martin," Thompson said, his voice warm with respect. "But the world needed to hear the truth. And you've given them that." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the general continued, his tone shifting slightly. "There's something else I need to talk to you about. It's time to recognize your contributions in a way that goes beyond just the words on a screen. You've been offered a place in the National Veterans Hall of Honor." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Kelly, despite himself, felt a twinge of surprise. He had never imagined such an honor. He had spent his life avoiding recognition, preferring the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. "The Hall of Honor?" Kelly repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Thompson said. "This isn't just about your story, Martin. It's about what you represent. The sacrifices you've made, the lives you've saved. It's time for those who never had a chance to speak for themselves to be heard. And this is the way it will be done." Kelly was silent for a long moment, the weight of the words settling in. He had never sought anything like this. The thought of standing before a crowd, of having his story enshrined for the world to see, felt foreign to him. But he understood the significance. It wasn't about him. It was about the men he had saved. It was about ensuring their legacy lived on, even if they couldn't speak for themselves. "I don't know what to say," Kelly finally said. "It's not something I ever imagined." "You don't have to say anything, Martin," Thompson replied. "Your actions have spoken for themselves. This is just the world's way of honoring you, of honoring all the men you fought alongside. It's a way to make sure your story, and theirs, is never forgotten." The phone call ended shortly after, but Kelly sat in his chair for a long time, reflecting on what had just been said. The Hall of Honor was an incredible recognition, but it felt strange. He had never done what he did for the accolades. He had simply done it because it was what needed to be done. Still, as the days passed, the weight of the decision began to settle in. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the men who had served, the ones who had never received the recognition they deserved. It was time for their stories to be told, and if this was how it would happen, then Kelly would accept it. He would stand in that hall not for himself, but for the men who had never made it home. The day of the ceremony arrived, and Kelly stood in front of the large building that housed the National Veterans Hall of Honor. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, the walls lined with names and faces of soldiers who had shaped the history of the nation. Kelly felt small in comparison, a part of a much larger story that spanned generations of sacrifice. As he walked into the hall, he was greeted by fellow veterans, each of them sharing a brief handshake or a quiet word of thanks. But it wasn't the greetings that affected Kelly. It was the sheer weight of the place, the thousands of names, the thousands of stories that had been told and now lived on in this hallowed space. And then it was his turn. When his name was called, Kelly walked to the front of the room, his legs steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. He didn't want to stand out. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But as he stood there, looking out at the crowd, he realized that this moment wasn't about him. It was about those who had fought alongside him, those who had paid the ultimate price, and those who would never get the chance to be recognized. The ceremony was simple, but for Kelly, it was profound. He wasn't just being honored for his actions. He was standing for all the soldiers who had ever served, for all the veterans who had been overlooked, for the countless lives that had been saved and lost along the way. And when it was over, as Kelly left the Hall of Honor, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done his duty, who had shared the stories of those who deserved to be remembered, and who had finally, after all these years, found peace. As the weeks went by, Martin Kelly continued to settle into this new version of his life. The recognition, though overwhelming at first, was starting to feel less like an intrusion and more like something he could live with. The phone calls slowed, the interviews became less frequent, and yet Kelly still found himself reflecting on his past, on the men he had fought beside, and on the deep scars, both seen and unseen, that they had all carried. Despite the accolades, despite the public acknowledgement, Kelly still felt like an outsider in this new world. It wasn't the world he had known. His world had been one of quiet service, of doing the right thing because it needed to be done, not because someone was watching. He still couldn't shake the feeling that this moment in the spotlight wasn't for him, but for everyone else. The ones he had fought for, the ones who hadn't made it out. He had lived through it, carried the weight of it for years, and now, after all this time, he was being asked to talk about it, to be remembered for it. It felt strange, like stepping into shoes that were never meant for him. But there was a deeper reason why Kelly had decided to share his story. He couldn't run from it anymore. It wasn't just about him. It was about the men who had given their lives, the ones who had never had the chance to tell their own stories. The truth had to be told, and Kelly was the one who would tell it. As much as he had avoided the spotlight, he realized that if he didn't speak up, their stories would be lost forever. The world would forget them. That was something he couldn't allow. One evening, as Kelly sat alone in his apartment, he received another call. It was a number he didn't recognize, but this time, he didn't hesitate. "Sergeant Major Kelly," the voice on the other end said. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Carter. We served together, back in the day. I heard you've been sharing your story, and I wanted to reach out personally. I just want to say thank you. You've done something important here." Kelly paused for a moment, hearing the weight in the young officer's voice. Carter had been one of the newer soldiers, someone who had been inspired by Kelly's quiet leadership, though Kelly had never seen it that way. To him, Carter was just another soldier doing his part, just as he had done for so many years. "Thank you, Colonel," Kelly replied, his voice calm, though he was still processing the flood of emotions that came with every recognition. It wasn't about me. It was about them. About the men who never made it back. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Carter knew exactly what Kelly meant. The mission they had served on together had been a turning point, a moment when everything had been on the line. "I know," Carter finally said. "But by telling your story, you're honoring them. You're making sure their sacrifices are remembered." Kelly didn't respond right away. He didn't know if he believed that. He hadn't done it for the recognition, and he didn't want to be a symbol of anything. But Carter's words stayed with him, echoing in the quiet of his apartment. Maybe he hadn't been ready to accept it, but perhaps this wasn't just about him anymore. Maybe it was about all the men who had been overlooked. The soldiers who had gone into battle without anyone ever asking their names, without anyone caring whether they made it home. Kelly had always felt like an outsider, someone who had never truly belonged in the world of recognition and awards. But now, as he listened to Carter, he began to understand that this wasn't about recognition for the sake of recognition. This was about making sure that the men who had fought beside him, the ones who had died beside him, were never forgotten. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," Kelly said, his voice low. "I've spent so long in the shadows, doing my job without anyone noticing. It's hard to step into the light now." "I understand," Carter said gently. "But think about it, Sergeant Major. What if your story is what helps other soldiers, the ones still out there, understand that they're not alone? What if telling your story helps future generations remember what it means to serve?" Kelly leaned back in his chair, taking in the weight of Carter's words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be the one to lead that charge, but maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about those who would come after him. Maybe it was about ensuring that the price of freedom, the cost of war, wasn't forgotten. The next morning, as Kelly walked into the local Veterans Hall to meet with some of his old comrades, he was greeted with handshakes, hugs, and respectful nods. They were veterans like him, silent heroes, men who had given everything for their country and asked for nothing in return. As he walked through the hall, Kelly couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not for himself, but for the men who had shared in the sacrifices. Their stories were just as important as his, and it was time to make sure they were all heard. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but he understood now that by telling his story, he could ensure that no one was forgotten. The stories of the men who had fought beside him would live on, and that was all that mattered. He wasn't a hero. He was just one man who had done his part, and now, it was his time to make sure others knew that they weren't alone. Kelly stepped forward, ready to tell the rest of the story, not for himself, but for them. The days following his speech at the Hall of Honor were quieter for Martin Kelly, but the weight of his decision to step forward had not yet left him. He was still adjusting to the new life he had inadvertently stepped into, where his past had become public knowledge and his actions were now subject to the world's gaze. His phone continued to ring, with reporters eager for more details, and his inbox filled with messages of gratitude and respect. But Kelly, true to his nature, found solace in his solitude. He had done what needed to be done. He had spoken his truth, and now, he could only hope that it would lead to something greater, something that would ensure the stories of the men he had fought with were remembered, not just his own. One afternoon, as he sat in his small apartment, his thoughts once again wandered back to the past, to the faces of the men he had served with, the ones who had never come home. It was always the same with Kelly. He had no interest in the accolades, no desire to be lauded for actions he had considered to be his duty. The guilt, however, remained. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, and in some ways, their sacrifice was still more real to him than the recognition he had just received. Kelly's mind kept drifting to that one mission, the mission that had defined not only his career, but also his very existence. He had led them out of hell, carried his men through impossible odds, and saved them when the world seemed to be falling apart. He had never sought recognition for it, but now, as his story became a national conversation, Kelly understood something important. It wasn't about him. It was about them. The ones who hadn't made it. The ones who never had the chance to share their story. The ones who had bled and died for a cause they believed in, just like him. He had saved lives, but in doing so, he had lost pieces of himself along the way. But there was peace in knowing that his actions were now being acknowledged, that the stories of those who had served and sacrificed would live on. As he sat at his desk, Kelly felt the pull of something deeper within him. It was the same sense of duty he had always carried, the drive to protect, to ensure that those who had given everything were never forgotten. And perhaps now, with his story being told, the country would finally understand the true cost of war, the true price of freedom. Another call came in, pulling Kelly from his thoughts. It was from an unfamiliar number, but this time, there was no hesitation. He picked up the phone. Sergeant Major Kelly? The voice on the other end was calm, steady, but it carried the weight of something important. This is Colonel Harris. I've been following everything that's been happening. I wanted to say how proud I am of you for sharing your story. Kelly leaned back in his chair, the familiar voice of his old friend offering some comfort. It's not about pride, Colonel, Kelly said, his voice low but resolute. It's about them. The men who didn't make it out. The ones who never had the chance to speak. I understand, Harris replied, his voice thick with emotion. But you've done something bigger than any of us could have imagined. You've ensured that their story will be remembered. And for that, you'll never be forgotten. Kelly didn't respond immediately. The weight of Harris's words lingered in the air. He had never seen himself as a hero, never wanted to be. But now, as the conversation continued, Kelly realized that maybe this wasn't about what he wanted or didn't want. Maybe this was about something larger than him. Maybe this was about preserving the legacy of everyone who had fought and sacrificed. As the conversation drew to a close, Kelly thanked Harris, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was clear. He had to keep going. There were still stories to be told, still lives to honor, and the men he had fought beside needed to be remembered. The next few months were a blur. Kelly gave more interviews, attended memorial services, and met with old comrades who had shared in the trials of their service. As the attention surrounding him grew, so did the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He had made a promise to those he had saved, and to those who had never returned home, that their stories would be told. And no matter how much he longed for the quiet life he once had, he knew he couldn't turn back now. He owed it to them. As he walked into another veterans gathering, Kelly couldn't help but feel the weight of the room. It was filled with men and women who had fought, who had bled, and who had given everything for their country. Their stories, too, needed to be heard. And as Kelly stepped into that space, surrounded by his fellow veterans, he finally understood something profound. He had been part of something much larger than himself. It wasn't just his story that mattered. It was the collective story of all who had served, all who had sacrificed, and all who had given their lives so that others could live. And as Kelly stood in that room, with the quiet respect of his peers surrounding him, he knew that, in the end, it had all been worth it. Not for the recognition, not for the medals, but for the stories that would live on, for the men who would never be forgotten. Martin Kelly stood at the window of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline. The soft hum of life outside was a stark contrast to the quiet storm raging. In his mind, the attention, the media, the recognition, it had all been overwhelming. And yet, despite it all, Kelly found himself in a strange sort of peace. He had told his story. He had honored the men he had fought beside, the men who had given everything and received nothing in return. And now, as the months passed, life seemed to be returning to a new kind of normal. The calls had slowed, the requests for interviews were less frequent, and Kelly had more time to reflect. But there was always something at the back of his mind, a lingering thought that refused to fade. Had he truly done enough? The truth was, Kelly had always been uncomfortable with the attention, uncomfortable with the spotlight. He was a man who preferred to stay in the background, doing his part without fanfare, quietly carrying the weight of his experiences without needing anyone to acknowledge it. But now, with his story shared, with the world finally recognizing the sacrifices made by him and his comrades, Kelly wondered if that quiet life was ever truly possible again. As he sat in the silence of his apartment, a knock on the door broke through his thoughts. He rose to answer it, finding an unexpected visitor on the other side, Colonel Harris. The sight of his old friend brought an unexpected sense of comfort. Harris had always been a steady presence in Kelly's life, someone who had witnessed his struggles, his triumphs, and his quiet resolve. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Harris said with a slight smile, stepping into the apartment. Kelly shook his head. "No, not at all. Good to see you, Colonel." Harris took a seat across from Kelly, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to check in on you. After everything that's happened, I imagine it's been hard to adjust." Kelly sighed, sinking back into his chair. "It's a lot to take in," he admitted, "but I think I'm getting used to it." "I'm glad to hear that," Harris replied. "But you know, Martin, I've been thinking. The story you've shared, it's had an impact. It's not just about your past. It's about something bigger." Kelly looked at Harris, puzzled. "Bigger? How do you mean?" "I mean that the men you saved, the ones who never made it back, they didn't just sacrifice for you or for the mission. They sacrificed for something greater. The freedom, the peace, the country we have now. And by telling their stories, you've helped ensure that their sacrifice isn't forgotten. You've given them a voice, a place in history." Kelly sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Harris's words settling in. He had always thought that sharing his story was about honoring his fallen comrades, about ensuring that their sacrifice was remembered. But Harris was right. It was bigger than that. It was about preserving the very ideals they had fought for, the freedom, the values, the things that made this country what it was. "I didn't do it for the recognition," Kelly said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Harris nodded, understanding. "I know. But sometimes, Martin, doing the right thing means making sure the world knows the truth. It means ensuring that future generations understand the cost of the freedoms they enjoy today." Kelly looked out the window again, the weight of Harris's words hanging in the air. He had never wanted the world to know his name. He had never wanted to be remembered. But now, he understood that by sharing his story, by giving a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves, he had done something far greater than he had realized. It wasn't about him. It was about ensuring that the sacrifices of those who had gone before him weren't lost to time. The world needed to understand the cost of freedom. It needed to understand the sacrifices made by those who had fought, bled, and died for it. And Kelly knew that as long as he lived, he would continue to carry that responsibility. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a witness to history, a keeper of stories, and a man who had given everything for something greater than himself. "Thank you, Colonel," Kelly said, his voice steady now, filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he had been missing. "I understand now. It's not over. The story needs to be told. For them." Harris smiled, a look of pride crossing his face. "I knew you'd get it. You've always had the heart of a soldier, Martin. But now, you're more than that. You're a keeper of legacies." Kelly nodded, his eyes focused on the future. The past had shaped him, but it was the future that would define the legacy he would leave behind. He had done what was needed when the time came. And now, he would continue to honor the memory of those he had fought beside, making sure their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The phone rang again, but this time, Kelly didn't hesitate to pick it up. He was ready to continue the journey he had started, not for the fame, not for the accolades, but for the men who had given everything. He had their stories to tell, and he would make sure the world would hear them. As Martin Kelly sat in his apartment, the world outside felt distant, almost unreal. The months of interviews, the recognition, the Hall of Honor, it was all still fresh in his mind, but he had settled into a rhythm. He had told his story, as difficult as it had been, and he had kept his promise to the men he had saved. Their stories would live on. That was what mattered. He no longer felt the weight of the spotlight bearing down on him. It was as if the world had heard him, heard them, and now, the silence that followed felt like peace. Kelly had never sought recognition, but in some ways, he realized he had found something even more important: closure. He had carried the burden of his past for so long, and now, for the first time in years, he could breathe without the constant weight of regret, guilt, and unanswered questions. But even with that peace, there was still a part of him that missed the camaraderie, the brotherhood. The men he had fought beside, the ones who had fallen, they were the ones he thought about every day. They had been his family in the most brutal of ways, and no amount of recognition or accolades could ever replace that. Kelly's phone rang once more, and this time, it was a call he had been expecting. It was Colonel Harris, the man who had stood beside him through the toughest moments. "Martin," Harris's voice came through clearly. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up." Kelly smiled, hearing the familiar warmth in his friend's voice. "I'm doing all right, Colonel. Just adjusting, you know." Harris chuckled. "I can imagine. It's been a hell of a ride." Kelly leaned back in his chair, the weight of Harris's words hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. The journey had been long, and while it wasn't over, it was different now. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to all of this," Kelly admitted. "But I guess that's part of it. It's not about me. It's about making sure the story of the men we lost doesn't fade into the background." Harris's voice softened. "You've done that, Martin. More than anyone could have hoped for. And in the process, you've given them a voice. That's something that can never be taken away." Kelly's gaze drifted toward the window, the sun setting behind the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and red, the world outside moving on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The truth had been spoken, the stories shared, and now, those who had been forgotten were finally remembered. "I just hope they understand," Kelly said quietly, more to himself than to Harris. "The ones who didn't make it back. I hope they know that they were never forgotten." There was a long pause before Harris responded, his voice steady and filled with understanding. "They know, Martin. They know." Kelly sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past settling in once more. But this time, it wasn't as heavy. He had done what needed to be done. The world had heard their story, and that was enough. As the call ended, Kelly put the phone down and let out a long breath. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the pressure of the past looming over him. He had finally found peace with the sacrifices he had made and the lives he had saved. The memories of the men he had lost still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. Kelly stood and walked over to the shelf where his medals rested. He didn't need to wear them. They were just symbols, reminders of the past. What mattered now was the legacy of those who had fought beside him, and the fact that they were no longer forgotten. The phone rang one last time that day, and Kelly answered without hesitation. "Martin, this is General Thompson," the voice on the other end said. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. Your story has made an impact. It's reminded the world of what it truly costs to protect this country. Kelly felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "Thank you, General," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been an honor to serve, to do what needed to be done." "The honor was ours," Thompson replied, his voice strong and respectful. "And now, we'll make sure the world remembers. We'll make sure that those who served, those who sacrificed, will never be forgotten." As the call ended, Kelly felt a quiet pride settle over him. The weight he had carried for so long had lifted. It wasn't the medals or the recognition that mattered. It was the knowledge that the men he had served with were finally getting the honor they deserved. And that was all that mattered. Kelly sat back down in his chair, staring out the window once more. The world outside continued to move forward, but in his heart, he knew that the stories of those who had served, who had bled, and who had died would never fade. They had been given a voice, and they would be remembered for as long as history allowed. This emotional story takes you through the journey of Martin Kelly, a man who served his country with honor but never sought recognition for his actions. As his story unfolds, we witness the emotional journey of a forgotten hero who quietly carried the weight of his past, saving lives without ever asking for anything in return. His emotional story becomes one of the most moving and powerful accounts of sacrifice, duty, and the bond between soldiers. The emotional story that Kelly shares is not just about him. It's about the men he fought alongside, the ones who never made it home. Through the ups and downs of his recognition, Kelly finds himself facing a reality he never expected, realizing that his emotional story is much bigger than he ever thought. This emotional story serves as a reminder of the true cost of freedom, the unspoken sacrifices, and the courage of those who never sought glory but gave everything for others. As Kelly shares his emotional story, he learns that it's not about him, but about honoring those who gave their lives, making sure their sacrifices are never forgotten.